Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome, guys, and welcome to the third Seasons on Saturday session, which will become a podcast for the fans. So let me introduce who we've got with us today. We've got our superstar from the Four Seasons, Lee Shapiro. We've got Mike Derrico. We've got Anthony Colatrella, and we've got Chuck Walker. And I'm Ken Chalmer. Okay, so thank you guys for joining us for this podcast, and it builds on what we did in the last podcast. But you guys, some of you guys asked me if we could go back to the beginning and we could start working through the story of the Four Seasons. And as we've got Lee, we can ask Lee about the songs and various aspects about what happened with them and any other stories he can tell us he knows from being a Four Season. And the Four Seasons started, as everybody knows, with Sherry, but before that, a year or two before, they were working with crew, and they were the Four Lovers live and doing very much harmony doo-wop style, similar to many groups that were around at the time. And then suddenly they came up with this song that seemed to me as a teenager, and maybe to many people, as a very much a novelty, screechy sound that was created just to attract attention rather than being a real voice. And that was the sound of Sherry. So going around individually, talking to you guys, first of all, those who saw the Four Seasons and followed the Four Seasons in 62, starting with you, Anthony, and do you think that it was a freak sound, or does it stand up, and does it stand up today as a great song from the early 60s?
Well, honestly, I never thought of it as a novelty sound or a screech sound. When I first heard it, I thought, wow, what is that? But in an admiring sense that someone could actually sing like that. And then it was reproduced with successive records. So I guess it depends on your definition of novelty. I have a trivia question. You know what record succeeded Sherry as the #1 on Billboard after their 5 weeks? It was the Monster Mash by the Halloween. Now that I consider a novelty song.
Yeah.
I didn't really consider Sherry or subsequent records just because of the falsetto as novelty. And of course, if you then look at it from a longer perspective, I mean, they actually structured the records to take advantage of the voice. So I wouldn't consider it then sort of, you can think of novelty as being something kind of fortuitous or just by luck. But I mean, they were specifically structuring the songs to take advantage of his ability with his falsetto. So
okay, so Chuck, I mean, you were on the other coast when
it was very, I agree with most of what Tony said, but I have a little different perspective. Growing up on the West Coast, and at that point in time was in Portland, Oregon, the Northwest, where we had basically garage rock. We had Paul Revere, we had the original Wailers out of Tacoma, we had the Kingsmen, and we had a bunch of other groups. And most of the music you heard was simply the 3-chord garage rock.
Yeah.
And once in a while, we would get some of the car sounds coming out of California. The radio stations that played rock at that time in Portland were total formula stations, so they weren't experimenting. They were playing things which they figured would get an audience. But Sherry to me was totally different in the August-September timeframe of 62. And I enjoyed the difference, not just because of the voice, but because of the instrumentation. There seemed to be a balance and a depth of field in that which you didn't hear in the garage rock, which I was used to. And that continued on with Big Girls Don't Cry and Walk Like a Man. You had the instro lead in, then you went to the vocal, and then you had them both together. and it just had an enriching sound, which I didn't hear in a lot of other stuff.
Lee,
Yeah.
yeah, you played this music for years and you know it. So what's your view on what the guys are saying?
Well, let me say this. It's not a great song. It's a great song in retrospect. It's the same song as everything else. The difference is the song plus Frankie Valli, plus the fact that Gaudio's format of the same chords, but the way he goes to a bridge in his format is the first time that was actually accepted. Usually it was the 1-6-2-5, da, 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 da. Then you go to the 4 chord you play, and you can name like 100 songs that are like that. Gaudio had a different sensibility, and I'll say that I couldn't even appreciate it at 19 when I joined, and thought that he was just playing the same old chord. Meanwhile, he kept having hit after hit, and failures too. But as I say, in retrospect, I'm amazed. And one of the big reasons that we all get to hear and like or not like the music that we grew up on and keep dear to our heart is for 2 reasons. One is airplay, and the other is what got airplay. And the story is, and I'm sure Ken knows it, but Sherry was broken on WMCA by Joey Reynolds. And I know Joey well, and he's still on the radio or somewhere here. But, and he's the guy that locked himself in the control room and played Sherry continuously for an hour while the program director bounced on the door. Broke the record. Then what happened is people figured out that's how you get a popular record. You get airplay. Well, how do you get a guy to play that record over and over? Well, this wasn't the case with Joey, but going forward, it was more of like the Alan Freed get paid off.
Yeah, payola.
And that's what made the 60s become the empire of record industry that it became. And then in the 70s, it was even more so, more greasing of the wheel.
Well, the record took off after it had, obviously, as we see in Jersey Boys, as it was on TV. And that's where the sales came. Yeah,
honestly, probably. And I know that Steve Allen on The Tonight Show mimicked the song and read it as a poetic reading. Sherry, but won't you come out? And it was a blessing. It's like a commercial for the song. I got to hear that. Well, who would make money with that song? And it went bananas. But honestly, some of the inside story, Gaudio even told me, and obviously the history of hits bears this out. Lee, if you want to write a hit song, start with one. So what that tells me is that he took Sherry and it worked. And so the format of it, some chords are different, but the format of it is exactly the same. It's a template. And that's not a put down on any level, because he was able within that template to keep pushing one wall out a little bit each time until we're doing in the 70s Who Loves You, which is the same chords as Sherry, but no one ever says that because he used those ingredients to make a different cake.
Right. Yeah, well, the story is that he recorded Walk Like a Man and Big Girls Don't Cry at the same sessions in November after they'd done the Christmas album, and they were doing a lot of session work, and Walk Like a Man was left over. And when they came to January to look for a release, that was the best of what they had.
Well, outside the magic of it, though.
That seems to be an incredible.
The magic of all of those records is Bob Crew's willingness. And today you don't get it as much because everything is in an audio library. If I want to get the sound of someone clapping in a garage, there's 4,000 of them I can download for 99 cents. It's a different world. But in those days, if you wanted a sound, you had to go make the sound. And I worked with Gaudio when he put a broom against the wall and made like a little cabasa thing. And I'm saying to myself as a young man, why would you do that? Get a cabasa. But that's not who they were organic. They were trying, getting the sound was like the first week of recording an album. It had nothing to do with the songs or rhythm tracks. It's like, okay, tomorrow's drum day. After that, we'll start working on guitar sounds. Because without that, you were building the same thing everybody else was building.
3-hour sessions, yeah. Now, the only one of us who found these songs, these 3 big hits, rather than in the sequence in which they were released, is Mike Derrico. So, Mike, what's your feeling about these songs?
You're right. I wasn't there. So I have no choice other than to approach this from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on what Lee was saying, where the chords of Sherry and Who Loved You are identical, but where Bob was pushing the wall further and further each time, to where you can't on just on the surface, you're not going to pick up that
That's correct.
those notes are the same. Whereas something like Run Around Sue and Put Her to Three, you can sing on top of each other, right? So that's absolutely, I agree with that 100%.
Although, if I may interject, it wasn't beyond Gaudio to do that kind of thing. And I just told you that he said, if you want to hit record, start with one. Okay, you ready? Do you guys know the song Candy, I Call My Lover Candy?
Yeah, that's
Candy, I call my lover. Yeah. He knows it. Candy, I call my lover Candy, because he's my sugar dandy.
Right.
I love you, baby, and if it's quite all right, I need you, baby.
Yeah.
It's a lift. But in those days, today, Robin Thicke would lose $4 million.
Yeah,
but back then, it was like, what are we going to do? Okay, let's just keep it, Meanwhile, think about if you owned a little teeny piece of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You.
Oh, Mike.
I would add, though.
I'm sorry, Mike. Go right ahead.
No, it's fine. I would add, though, that the song, I don't think the song was a freak. I think it was the right song at the right time. It was, happy, joyous music in a dark time. I mean, Cherry and Big Girls Don't Cry are just passing each other, one on a downslope, one going upwards during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Timeline is everything here. This is a song that has more roots in the past, I think, although the template is there. The template is used before, the template is used after. I think that we must remember that the Four Seasons start out primarily as a vocal group, where the vocals and the vocal harmonies kind of become the reason for the song's existence, right? They're rooted in that 50s thing. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't know that doo-wop was called doo-wop at the time.
No.
I think doo-wop was a phrase that was kind of coined in the early 70s by some DJ whose name escapes me.
With Northern Soul, it's the same thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, Sherry is rooted in that vocal thing. And it was, the technology of the 60s had not progressed. It was still 1962. I think you have one foot in the past where you're kind of rooted in that vocal thing, but it still sounds very kind of current. But I don't know that it was a freak, but I also don't know that it necessarily encapsulates the sound of the early 60s. There was a lot of, because it necessarily
the group had double roots in this context at this time of Vee-Jay when they joined Vee-Jay, because they'd been the Four Lovers, and the four tracks that they'd were with Gaudio had written for Bob Crew that had turned into Billy Dixon the Topics releases before they were the Four Seasons. That style of harmony doo-wop, which is like the Five Satins or other groups at the time, was very rooted in the club scene and the 50s style. So there's a lot of stuff of Vee-Jay that is very strong ballady material in this harmony style, combined with Crew's sort of highly percussive and highly novel ideas for production. So those seem to carry through into the first two albums at Vee-Jay, and seem to be the basis for success.
Are there any instances in pop music before Cherry where the falsetto is pushed up front to a lead vocal? Can we say that they were? Can we at least say that it was innovative in that respect?
Yeah, there are a few doo-wop examples, but not very many, and nothing that became a hit.
Not that prominent. But Jay Siegel of the Tokens says, when they did Lion Sleeps Tonight, that was putting the falsetto up front. So he likes to say that was the first group to do it. But I think,
and Smokey Robinson had a falsetto in the early days of Motown, but clearly, I asked the question whether it was a freak, but the thing is that people liked falsetto in the early 60s. It was a sound that we could relate to.
Sherry had a different hook. that attracted kids more so than some other songs. First of all, it was a girl's name, so you got a lot bigger audience. But people listened to the lyrics more of Sherry than they did a bunch of other songs. And I can remember in high school, we had a classmate by the name of Sherry, and she had a red dress. So she would get kidded about her red dress, so much so that she stopped wearing it. And then you went to the Big Girls Don't Cry and a Walk Like a Man. Those became cliches that were used in the high school I went to, which you didn't hear that same stuff on other songs because kids didn't know the lyrics. The lyrics were simple enough that they could remember them.
Everything Chuck just said is it, period. That's he, nail it, hammer it down. Ear candy, Frankie's voice. Matter of fact, Sandy Linzers, who is a dear friend, and I just spoke to him yesterday, as a matter of fact, who wrote many of the hits. And I once said to him, Sandy, it's amazing, your songs, one after the other, hits written with Gaudio, written with Denny Randell, all these things. And he looked at me square face, and this is a gifted hit writer. And he said, we had Frankie. The sound had become part of the culture by the time Big Girls Don't Cry came out. The second song was the season sound. It had, you know, they were like the American Beatles. They had double-sided hits and sharing the top 10 with the Beatles, and you know, and then of course Frankie hates the Beatles, and we know why, because of their invasion into his world. And there's no denying that Frankie and the Four Seasons were a very creative group of pop people, and the Beatles are geniuses. I think, you know, I mean, it's a different, it's soup and nuts.
Well, that's what we're going to talk about when we get to Phillips. The problems at Vee-Jay seem to, two things happened to Vee-Jay after these three hits. And one was that they suddenly decided, because they were booked to the Cabana, that they were going to do a middle of the road type act for the adult audiences. And they recorded an album which would eventually get released as Live on Stage. But it only had one song in it that was a pop song, and one song in it that was about how they wrote their pop songs. So there's nobody can answer the question as why did they suddenly decide to try to go?
I can answer the question.
What's the question?
Why did they go for that adult audience in mid 1962?
I know why.
Three.
Well, when you think
From day one, if I may, from day one, and meeting with Frankie in his apartment when they were on the skids and all that, he wanted to be Frank Sinatra. He wanted to be a solo artist from the day I met him in 1973. And his version of that was Sinatra and Bobby Darin and playing Caesar's Palace, which is where Under My Skin came from, because it was Sinatra's tune and they did it as like an homage to him. But it's interesting. Frankie made so many wrong decisions that worked. And when I joined Frankie, we weren't doing Candy Girl. We weren't doing Marlena. We weren't doing Under My Skin, but we opened with I Got Love from Pearly, the Broadway show. And I was 19. I said, what are we doing? But he wanted a, hey, you know, like Bobby Darin.
But on the for this Live on Stage session, you're right, he wanted to be Frank Sinatra. So he does the Andrews Sisters, I Can Dream, Can't I? You know, and he does My Mother's Eyes, which he'd always done in the clubs. You know, this was him in the clubs as the Four Lovers.
Absolutely, correct, were his roots.
But they didn't release that at the time in 63. It was canned, and they went in and they did Ain't That a Shame album. And that didn't have the same success, but it still had Candy Girl on. And this was when Charlie says he first started to become the arranger that he wanted to be.
He's unbelievable to this day, my dear friend, my mentor, and there is nobody that I'm aware of that orchestrates as perfectly to the vocal as him. Maybe, well, honestly, Barry Manilow could do it himself. He uses Charlie, but Charlie Colollos has a gifted ear beyond. It's like some people play the piano for a singer, and then Manilow plays, and he frames the vocal like he's holding it in a little cup.
Yeah.
And that's an art. and that's Colello's orchestration heart. And honestly, he has more heart when he writes than just being a guy. But I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Candy Girl showed them that they could still. They really needed to target the teen audience because they had Marlena, and then all the disputes started.
Ronnie.
Before they left Vee-Jay, the whole thing fell apart with Vee-Jay because they sued Crew because they weren't getting paid enough, and then Crew sued Vee-Jay because he wasn't getting paid, and they were, the whole thing stopped. Now, normally, as Anthony was saying earlier, a group, and Chuck was saying, I think Chuck, you were saying, a group didn't really last very long these days.
Yeah, my recollection back in the early 60s, even to the early 70s, is that, the tenure of a group, once it was picked up by a label and started releasing records and had hits, they had a lifetime of 2 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And, they'd get 2 or 3 hits, maybe 2 or 3 albums, and then they'd either break up or they'd disappear. I mean, all the groups that I remember, the only ones that continued on were the different iterations of the Seasons and
Stones.
Well, I'm gonna say the American groups. The Stones were definitely in. The Stones probably the classic, the old time. But you've got the Byrds, Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Beach Boys. They self-destructed, so they just don't. Valli is the only one that tried to continue, and as Lee has said, his focus was on Sinatra. It wasn't on teeny bopper rock.
No, and I'll tell you something else about Frankie. And he told me this, and when Dimitri left the group, and that brought way for Don Ciccone to come in. When Dimitri left the group, Frankie said to me, "I'm going to tell you something. Never stop doing what you believe in, even if it's not working. Keep doing it." That's why he stayed around. He's had 4 careers, multi-million-dollar careers, 4 times, all the way up, all the way down.
Yeah.
So the reason is, what he's telling me is, if it feels right, do it. He used to say to me, he misses the old days of making records, because if it felt right in the studio, it was right. They released it. Whereas today we examine that the tambourine in the last chorus isn't quite synced to the drums. That's foreign to him. He don't want to hear about that.
Yeah.
He wants to make joyous stuff. Crew wanted that, and Gaudio was he was like the referee of that. He was, no, it has to be perfect. It's not. Yeah. So needless to say, that's a fabulous team.
They nearly
Gaudio, Crew.
Yeah, they nearly fell apart at this point in time, and this is, they were in dispute, and Bob Crew threatened to form a new Four Seasons, and he started rehearsing Artie Wayne and
Larry Santos.
And what were they going to be called?
And he was gonna, yeah, it may have been a bluff. He made the call. Yeah. Frankie was working with Al Kasha and started and recorded the the Forevers, Be My Girl, and also at the same session recorded Like You. And I have to stop and tell you guys, you've heard the version of Like You that I've put up on YouTube. And it's a Bob Gaudio song, and it was written as one of these demos back in 1961 and never released. It was recorded again in 1962 with Bob Gaudio, which has never been released. And it was recorded again in 1963 with Al Kasha and never been released. But all 3 of those versions are going to be in the box set that's coming out this. Now, why that happened, I've got no idea, but all of
sheer luck. Sheer luck on your part.
All of the versions of Bob Gaudio, the same Bob Gaudio song, but completely different arrangements. But, Valli's vocal on each of them is impeccable. And that's what you say, Lee. His voice could carry any arrangement.
For Sandy Linzer to say, instead of saying, "Well, yeah, thank you very much, I've written all those hits," for his answer to be, "We had Frankie," that tells the whole story. It tells the whole story, because he's had hits with Kool and the Gang and with, Whitney Houston and Four Tops.
His final effort with Frankie would be the last analog tape that exists in the Four Seasons Partnership archive, and that is the Street Fighter album, which
Terrible. A terrible album.
but he wrote
Horrible.
and produced.
I don't give a shit. I love
It's got
Sandy.
some
He's
good
like a brother.
songs.
That might be one of the worst things I ever heard. It's
Oh,
plagiaristic. It's terrible.
I
The
listened
song Valerie, come on. The song Valerie isn't Gloria by Laura Branigan. Come on. I knew Irwin very, very well. He was a dear friend, and Sandy's still a dear friend. That song is plagiaristic. Period. And the album sucks. And Frankie's not a street fighter. It's like working with Mickey Rooney and saying giant among men. Yeah, it's a stupid thing to do. He's not tough. He's hip. He's not tough. You know what I mean?
Well,
He's like,
it even had Gershwin on it.
Okay,
I'm telling you,
Mike
that might-
Rico. I mean,
I think that album is a disgrace.
yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I don't agree with you, Lee, but
I
Mike,
know you don't.
Mike, what do you think of it?
Street Fighter.
Yeah.
You know, for years, Frankie always talked about we're putting a new album out, and every year we go see him. We used to see Frankie in whatever incarnation he had in the summer, and it was usually, at the time, it was the Garden State Art Center. So every year, going back from like 70, 78, 70, I guess from the reunion onward, I guess 1980 onward, we got a new album out. We're recording a new album. We're recording a new album. So Street Fighter finally came out in 1985. And it was just a big conglomeration of every trend that was going on in music at the time. And I felt the same way, honestly, with Hope and Glory. I felt Hope and Glory was kind of like you can make a double record out of Street Fighter and Hope and Glory, because Hope and Glory, which was out, I believe, in 92 or 94, was almost sounded out of date at the time. It was like, well, this could have had a chance in 1984, but I mean, look, I love Street Fighter only for the fact that I was a kid. It was still part of my childhood, and I heard it a lot, but it hasn't aged well.
No.
Is Moonlight Memories in that album?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It was.
I like that song, Lee.
I mean, I like this. I like the title track. You know, Street Fighter, Larry Lingle. That whole incarnation was.
So Lee,
I gotta tell you, man, the mistake they made.
metal.
Listen to me. The mistake that he made is he made a sweet deal with Linzer and Irwin and gave them the writing project of doing the whole album. Now this is Frankie Valli. Don't you think that like Paul Anka and Smokey Robinson and Barry Mann, wouldn't they have written songs for him? Peter Allen in the day, just anybody. But no, I think he gave it to Sandy and Irwin, again, who I have ultimate respect and love for, because it was a financial good idea to do something between them. And as a result, that's what you got. If they had contributed just,
didn't he?
yes. If they had just done Street Fighter and one other song and had 9 other people write, from Lionel Richie to but the problem is, and the reason they made a publishing deal with Irwin and Sandy, it's just the same reason that Carrie was not the B-side of Our Day Will Come. Because they realized if they put You Can Bet I Ain't Going Nowhere by Metros and Appel on it, they owned all the publishing. Yeah. And with us, and the writing. And with us, they'd have to give up 25 cents of the dollar. So we ended up an album cut with that. That's what happened with Street Fighter, hence the creative masterpiece that it is.
Okay. All right. So going back then, sorry for that slight diversion. It's just that I had
Wait, Ken, what do you think of Street Fighter?
Me?
What?
Yeah.
I quite like it because I've got the master tape, and the way it's arranged and the way it's mixed is very good, because the
song.
Each of the songs has got the season.
If you played the song on the piano, would you like it?
No.
Then it's a production.
It's a production. It's the production. Yeah.
Okay, I'll buy that with you. Okay. Absolutely.
So going back to the Four Seasons falling apart in 1963 with lawsuits, and just to give you a little bit of feedback as we close the period on Vee-Jay, is that when I went back to the Four Seasons partnership storage, it is an absolute mess. All as they had from this period was crappy safety copies of the albums from EMI, or from, they didn't even have Sherry because they'd lost it. And Bill England had reconstructed it back in 1988 to be able to put out on CD. Now, what I found was that while these albums didn't sound right, what happened in '66 when Vee-Jay went bust, the deal was, that came out of the court case, was that they would get the masters back if Vee-Jay went bust. And in August 1966, they went bust. And so Vee-Jay supplied them with 72 masters on tape. And those,
hence oldies, the beginning of oldies.
yeah. And so all of these tracks are all in random order on 10 tapes, stereo and mono. I went back and I played those. They are pristine copies, absolutely perfect sonically. So I told the engineer, don't use the safety albums, because that's what everybody else has used, and they're crappy.
Mhm.
And so he's been told to use all of the Vee-Jay masters, which are only probably second, maybe third generation instead of fifth, sixth. And I played some of them last night and they're pristine. And so that is what we're going to get. And I think that will reveal just how good Crew and the guys were in the Vee-Jay days. Because
Using 2 tracks and 3 tracks and bouncing. That's why the tambourine is always the loudest thing on the record in the 60s, because it was the last thing to be recorded.
Yeah.
As they bounced back and forth.
But the mono masters
tape
are
machine
absolutely
to tape
superb, and so we'll be getting those in the box set, which is coming out by the 1st of July, I'm told. So,
But act now and you can get yours for $39.95 and lunch with Ken Charmer and the Tupperware.
If you don't waste your money on all the stuff that's been out on CD before, because this stuff will be better. Well, I'll talk about the Philips stuff next time. But
Don't you have a card that's a little commercial? It's a little buy now or a placard.
I'm not happy with the box set, guys. I've said this, and I'll say it again because we haven't got what we wanted. Did you know, guys? Well, you guys know. I had an email from Artie Schrock, and he wanted to know whether we'd found a song called "Alone Again," which he wrote and Frankie had recorded. And so I wrote back to him and said, yes, we found it. It was on a tape box, but when we opened the tape, it was the Timeless album in mono. And we don't know where the tape has gone. It's somewhere buried amongst 200 plus 5-inch reels in the storage, which hasn't been properly annotated or listened to. And these unmarked tapes, who knows what's on them?
Ken, where are they stored?
They're stored in California, in a storage unit.
They were not stored as part of the Universal Fire tapes.
No, they're in the Four Seasons storage.
So they're in a distinct separate.
They're still there. They're still there.
Okay.
But all we
Looks
could
like
get
Raiders
out,
of the Lost Ark.
all we could get out was, yes, Raiders of the Lost Ark. What was what Bill England was paid to give us, and he gave us just the stuff that was labeled Four Seasons. So the unmarked stuff we didn't get. So that's the story of how the Vee-Jay tapes have been salvaged and recovered. So any final thoughts on the Vee-Jay period from you guys going around?
Yeah, we need to figure out a way how to get to those boxes.
Well, it would require,
You're in charge, Chuck.
Yeah, it would require Guardio to allow me, you, or somebody else to go and listen to them for free.
Never.
I said I'll go and listen to them if he'll pay my airfare and my hotel.
Forget it. Forget it. He wouldn't do it if you paid him.
He wouldn't mix the 16-track Motown session tapes down for what we wanted. A review of all the Motown. He gave us 13 tracks that were either already completed and mixed down, or maybe he did 2 of them.
I have to tell you that from my experience with Gaudio, and I don't mean this in a negative way on any level, he's entitled to run his life and his business in the way he did. He's a very nice man. But when he does something, before he does it, in my opinion, the consideration is, how will I benefit if I do this? And then that's what he weighs. And there's a lot of people like that. And some of them get very rich, and some of them are very creative, and some of them aren't. But my point being, then there are people who don't use that. They say, what could it hurt to give this guy, instead of what could I get out of it? And that's the difference.
Yeah.
You know, the Crew Gaudio Valli Colello Consortium is one of two independent groups that have survived since the late 50s, early 60s. They have ignored the big record companies. They've done things their way, and they've got lucky.
Without any question.
The only other artist on the American side of the pond that I'm aware of that has had that same success is Willie Nelson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they are lucky guys, because they've got us, and I think that not many artists today of their age could say they've got such devoted and committed fans.
Prince was a rebel. Prince was a gifted man, and he was a rebel, and he left his record company, and he made all kinds of statements about it. And he was a mega star who ended up killing himself with drugs, like so many unfortunately do.
Yeah.
Who's to say what Amy Winehouse might have accomplished?
Or achieved. Yeah. Well, we've got what we've got. We'll
or even Frankie Lyman, or even Frankie Valli.
I'll have to wind it up there, guys, because we will run out of our Zoom meeting time in a few a minute or two. So thank you for your participation. And the next session, I would hope we can go on to talk about how Charlie Colello changed the sound and the fortunes when they went to Philips. So thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to doing another session in the next month, and hope you're interested enough to want to be involved, guys. Is that okay?
It's fun, Ken. This is fun when we do it. We do it because it's fun.
Yeah, we do. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye all.
Look after
Take care,
yourself.
everyone.
Watch out
Stay
for
warm.
those storms. Okay. Take care.